Hello, welcome to the Lives in the Philosopher series. I'm Ryan McBride, and I'll be talking today about Ludwig Wittgenstein. And so I'm gonna start by talking about Wittgenstein's life, which he lived in the first half of the 20th century, and none of us were really alive back then, but we do know that there was a lot going on in the early 20th century, so much that we're still dealing with today. A lot of the political and social inertia began then. He's a bit of an enigmatic figure to talk about, both in philosophy and just casually, because he himself was a bit of an oddball. He's a bit of a loner, and kind of kept people at a distance. And of course, if you've tried to read Wittgenstein, I won't assume that anyone's actually read him, and that's not really the goal of this lecture, is to assume that you did. But his work is really dense. It's not user friendly, and so he's a bit opaque. But let's get started with his life and try to make sense of that. There's so much that's so much enjoyable. He's an Austrian British philosopher. He was born in 1889 in Austria, Vienna, Austria. Was born into one of the richest families in the Habsburg Empire. So his father was a steel tycoon. So you can think that, essentially you're born into the Bill Gates family. That's kind of what what the equivalent today would be. He was the last of 8 children, so it's a massive family. The Wittgensteins were a big family. He was the 8th child, and he was sort of the straggler, and they didn't have high hopes for him. We'll put it that way. That growing up in the Wittgenstein household was really demanding because they were so affluent. They had a very big cultural and social standing in Vienna, and so his home was actually one of the preeminent salons in Vienna for music and the arts, and the Wittgenstein family were patrons of the arts because they literally had so much money. And so it was very common in the Wittgenstein household to run into different composers like Brahms and Mahler and all these people, because they hung out there. They would play music there and things. The house had 8 grand pianos, something like this. So grew up in an extremely musical family. Wittgenstein himself is known for having perfect pitch, so he could kind of whistle with perfect pitch and things like that. But he was maybe the least gifted musically. 2 of his brothers were world-class composers of a kind, but they had very different careers. So living in the Wittgenstein household was very intense, so much so that 3 of his brothers actually ended up committing suicide because of the intensity of what it was like to live with their father and mother. So just to give you a kind of quick example here, he had an older brother named Hans. He wanted to be a composer, ended up killing himself because his father really wanted an heir to his, steel tycoon business. And the kid's like, no, I want to finger paint. And the dad's like, no, you have to be a businessman. And he's like, okay. So he runs away to the U.S. and then disappears off a boat in Chesapeake Bay. So probably jumped into it. Had another son who wanted to go into theater. Can't do that. You got to go into business. And I believe he killed himself for the similar reasons. And then another brother killed himself because of business complications, probably due to either the First or Second World War, right? So a lot going on in that family, a lot of pressure to succeed and distinguish yourself. And then along comes Wittgenstein, who, by the way, was not very promising. As I mentioned, he wasn't really expected to amount to much. And in fact, for the first 2 years of his life, he didn't. He was actually mute, which is ironic because he worked in the philosophy of language, but he didn't speak for the first 2 years of his life. What ends up happening is he grows up, and parents realize he's incredibly mechanically inclined and very good at engineering. So there's an anecdote that he had disassembled like the family sewing machine, right? And then reassembled it. And then from that built a model out of like paper and wood that could actually make a couple stitches, which is fascinating. He was young, I think single digits young when he did this. And so naturally he goes into engineering when he comes of age. He goes to kind of typical schools. Nothing really fancy in Vienna, but then he goes to Manchester, England, where he studies aerodynamics. And this is really when things start to change in his life for him. So he goes in there. You have to remember this is around the 1910s. So flying isn't quite a thing that humans do very well yet. So his research is focused on aerodynamics, on propellers, how the wind, blah, 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 all this. He patents a machine of some kind that you can go still find the patent for it. So he was productive in that part of his life, but As an engineer, you study mathematics, and this ends up becoming his passion. And he's not interested in mathematics solely from the applied mathematical perspective, right? Like doing things with math, but why math is the way it is. And this is kind of the dawning of his philosophical conscience, if you will. And so he starts reading theoreticians of that time who are, if you know of them, it would be Bertrand Russell, Alfred North Whitehead, two English mathematicians and philosophers, and then Gottlieb Frege, German philosopher. These guys, these guys are revolutionary in their own right. They essentially transform the way that we think of logic and mathematics today. And the way that they changed it is essentially laid the groundwork for what we do with even like coding and things like this. So they really transformed logic at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. From how it had been done for over 2,000 years by Aristotle, in which logic, maybe not mathematics, but logic was dominantly done with natural language. Wittgenstein gets very excited by this, and he decides he's going to meet these people because he's Wittgenstein. You know, he was born in the richest family. There's no sort of social barrier for him to just show up in your office hours and be like, hello, here I am. So that's what he does. He goes to Cambridge, that's where Russell is based, and meets Russell and starts talking to him about his mathematics. And the letters from this time are really funny on Russell's side. Russell had a very interesting romantic life, to say the least, but he was writing to his mistress or something and saying, this crazy German guy just barged into my room and started yelling at me in German. Yes, he was speaking German. No, he's not German. He's Austrian, right? But yelling at me in German, I have no clue what to do. And furthermore, he won't stop following me. And that's what Wittgenstein did, is he just followed Russell around on campus, attended the lectures, challenged, engaged, and so on and so forth. It sort of plagued Russell, but it started to dawn on Russell that maybe there's something going on here with this young man. And so there's a kind of a story that eventually Wittgenstein was talking to him, and he said, listen, I need you to tell me, you know, he was a very adamant, very intense person. I need you to tell me if I'm an idiot or not. He used different words, but I need you to tell me if I'm an idiot or not. If I'm an idiot, I'm going to go do aerodynamics because I'm supposed to be in school right now. If I'm not an idiot, I'm going to do philosophy with you. And Russell's like, I don't know if you're an idiot, bro. You got to write me something. So he does. Wittgenstein writes something. We don't have that on record. We don't know what it is, but allegedly from the very first sentence of whatever Wittgenstein wrote, probably on the Principia Mathematica, which is like this major logical work that Russell and Whitehead were working on. He writes something on it. Russell reads the first sentence. He's like, holy shit, okay, this guy's the real deal. And so Wittgenstein enters the English philosophical tradition where he's dominantly known even to this day. Studies there, takes courses, ends up kind of dominating the philosophical discussion, is known as Russell's protege. Eventually, as the story goes, the son always rises up to strike down the father, and this is what Wittgenstein decides he's going to do. He thinks that Russell and Whitehead made some issues in their logic, and he's going to fix it. But bear in mind, by the way, these are theoretical philosophers, mathematicians in their 40s and 50s, and towards the end of their career, or late career, and this young man is in his very early 20s, and he's telling them, you guys are wrong, and then he proceeds to show them why, right? So very sassy guy, but seemed to have the brains to at least convince them that was something he was going to do. Then we had a problem with Wittgenstein's general workflow, is that he didn't produce much. And this is true during his life. He didn't publish much of anything. And so, the question was always like, great, I believe you from conversation that you're going to surpass me. Demonstrate that, write the book, And Wittgenstein was someone with a very unbalanced soul. He didn't want to be in engineering. He didn't really like academia. He didn't really like anything that he did. He was always trying to find these correct conditions. And so he decided he was going to exile himself to the northern reaches of Norway for a couple of years so he can finish his book in solitude. And this is what he does. He goes up to a fjord up in Norway and lives there by himself in a hut that he had made for him. And he just, walks around in the hut cussing at himself in German and working out these philosophical problems. Doesn't finish them, but this is what he does. So this is kind of marks the first major period of his life, and we already get a sense that he's a very serious person, very intense person to be around, and his approach to philosophy and to life in general is very extra. It's very intense, right? He's like, I can't write a book unless I'm in these most extreme of conditions. His biographer Monk tends to write of him as if he was seeking sainthood, right? And so everything that he's doing in his life is somehow trying to achieve moral perfection through language. And we see this also in his behavior with this sort of self-exile and things like that. His time in the wilderness, if you will, was cut short, though, because the first of many major world events happened, which is World War I. That's a lot more compelling for Wittgenstein as I don't know a better word, as a bourgeoisie Austrian. He has a very strong sense of fraternity, and he decides he's going to volunteer for the war effort, and he does. And so he joins the war effort as a grunt, leaves school, doesn't finish his work, and enters the war. At this time, and so some of his motivation, by the way, his motivation for doing this, besides fraternity, is this belief he has. He has this belief, if I encounter death, this will be an opportunity for me to transform myself morally. And so he's kind of like seeking out opportunities to die. I mean, it ends up being kind of a morbid moment in his life. He wants to be on the front. He spends a good deal of time on the back lines. But he wants to be in the trenches. He wants to be shot at with mortar fire and ran over, set aflame. I don't know what he wanted, but he really wanted this. He reinforces this idea. He's on a tour of Galicia and ends up finding a book that becomes very important to him at this time, Tolstoy's Gospels in Brief. So if you're not familiar with Tolstoy, Leo Tolstoy was a Russian novelist and kind of a Christian apologist. So Wittgenstein becomes very enamored with Christianity as a private and as spiritual experience. I think he was probably a pretty bad Catholic, if a Catholic at all, but there was definitely the spiritual aspect spoke to him, right? And so he becomes known as the man with the Gospels because he's still an academic. He's still a little bit hoity-toity, and he would kind of push things onto people. And so when they encountered him, they're like, hey, if you go talk to Wittgenstein, you're going to get a big dose of Tolstoy and Christianity, right? This ends up informing his sort of spiritual beliefs, and spirituality becomes a very private aspect of his life. Well, he still has a book to write, and these problems are still haunting him. These issues with logic are still haunting him a lot. And so he's spending his time now on the front. He ends up getting moved to the front, and so gets medals of honor for distinguished bravery. But so he's out there in the trenches, and he's scribbling logic in notebooks, which is wonderful. And you can read these notebooks today, by the way. They've been published. He ends up actually finishing what is known as his first book, and that is the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. I'm just going to call it the Tractatus. It's a pun on another logical title from the history of philosophy. We can ignore that. But it is something like, he publishes, during the war effort, he ends up getting this book published. It's about 89 pages. And it's a series of propositions that are numbered in a very specific order. And they're so dense and like so crystallized, the thought in them, that they're pretty much only the meaning of the propositions, the sentences, are really only kind of clear to him, right? They don't really make sense to most anyone else. And this being his opinion. So people, I read your book, and anytime he would get letters were a big thing in these times. Get people's letters, and he's like, you don't know what the hell I'm talking about. Especially Russell, Whitehead, Frege. These people had no clue what he was talking about. But he didn't seem to be very interested in explaining it, right? And so what we actually get in the Tractatus today is something like an outline for a book. Like each point was something that he should have expounded on, and he didn't, because he thought it's all there, it's crystal clear. If you don't get it, you're an idiot. Well, it turns out even he doesn't get it. After about 10 years or so, people start talking to him about it later, and he's like, I don't even remember what I was saying, right? But trying to understand what this book is, and later when we get into his philosophy, I actually won't be treating this text at all because it's so dense. I don't get it. It's not in my wheelhouse. But something that we can try to appreciate it thematically is that it's a piece of art. It's a kind of modernist piece of art akin to the painters like Gustav Klimt or writers like Hemingway, all these kinds of things, right? I find myself that the Tractatus is an aesthetic work or an aesthetic experience when you read it. Back to Wittgenstein's insane life, publishes the book, and then immediately is captured by the Italians and is taken in as a prisoner of war. Don't worry, he was fine. He was taken in to a concentration camp in Como, Italy. I don't know if you've ever heard of Lake Como in Italy, but it's probably one of the most beautiful landscapes in northern Italy in total. And so he probably had a very good time. So then we have a major turn. So at this point, he's written that book. He's proved these people wrong. He's written the book, and now he's going to move on. And he said, and he believed this. He's like, I've solved philosophy. There's nothing more to be said. And this is how he ends that book. He's like, anything else that could possibly be said in philosophy is just an error. It's a mistake. And we'll get into this later. You have to go live the philosophy. It's an ethical thing. It's a practice. It's not a language activity. And so he was done. He was like, philosophy is dead. I killed it. And he believed that. And so he gets out of being a prisoner of war. And what he ends up doing is, at this time, his parents die, which means he becomes the inheritor of one of the largest private inheritances in the world. Something to know about his father, as I said, he was a very, very savvy businessman. And so he did a little thing we like to call offshoring, essentially, with his money. And so he would invest in, basically in the U.S. Stock market, where the stock was a lot more stable. So even during the Second World War, the Wittgenstein finances were more or less safe, even through that. And you have to keep in mind, by the way, at this point, after World War I, his country doesn't exist anymore. Austria disappeared. It'd be like if right after the Iran War, the U.S. just disappeared. That's what happened to him. After the First World War, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was dismantled. And so he's kind of the German word for this is Heimatslos. He's homeless. He doesn't have a home. He has a house, but he doesn't have a home. And this more or less continues to the end of his life. But he decides, I'm done with this. And furthermore, because I need to live this philosophy now, I don't want my inheritance. So he works with the family lawyers, and he tells them, and he makes sure that he's unable to get a penny out of, the kabillions of dollars that the Wittgenstein family had. Only his sisters could get access to it. And any money that he had residual to himself or whatever access to the fortune he had, he actually donated it to artists, which I think is really cool. I wish more rich people did that. It's just like invest in the arts, but they don't do this. So, but he did. He invested in some people like Georg Trakl. He's an Austrian poet. You probably haven't heard of him, but he also gave a crap ton of money to Rainer Maria Rilke, who is a well-known poet in his own right. You probably might have heard of him. Gives all his money to arts, locks it all away, and he gets this genius idea. All right, now I'm just going to serve the world, and I'm going to become an elementary teacher. Hardcore Wittgenstein's like, I'm going to be an elementary teacher. And he does this. He studies, learns how to teach it, and then he moves. This is another exile moment in his life. He moves himself to rural Austria. Now, this man could not be more different than anyone he would encounter in this space. But he goes out there anyways, teaches elementary children. Of course, the people in the village, right? They're like very, very leery of Wittgenstein. He's a very weird dude. Like, well, one, like you're a rich city person. Why are you here? So there's already kind of like a class issue. But Wittgenstein by default doesn't really hold himself the way even, normal affluent people might, right? So he just kind of sticks out, and they're really distrustful of him. But he implements really kind of novel teaching methods, a lot of hands-on methods for learning mathematics, engages in a lot of excursions and things. So he ends up being a very effective teacher. He publishes his second book, or he writes his second book at this time, which is actually an encyclopedia for children. So he identifies a weak point in the children's material goods, right? Like they don't have the textbooks they need, and it doesn't exist, so he just writes it. This book was probably more famous than the Tractatus in terms of reach, I would say. I think it was used for decades in Austria, which is super cool. So that's actually his second book. No one talks about that, but we have now gone over his two of his works. I'll tell you the third one. He wrote a short essay when he was a professor, critiquing logical form. That's all he published in his lifetime. Done. So you know all of Wittgenstein's works now. Back to the village. In this time, hitting children was normal. And so like if you weren't doing your lesson right or remembering your vowels or whatever, it was very customary to maybe slap you on the hand with a walking stick or a ruler. Or if you're a woman, you probably had your hair braided because you're a woman, you got to have your hair braided. And so you would take them and yank them, right? It's a bit intense, but apparently doing that makes you smarter. I don't know. I've never tried it. Well, he has to leave the village eventually because what happens is he ends up smacking a kid too hard and the kid collapsed. Turns out the kid was actually suffering from leukemia. The child dies years and years later, but he smacks his kid so hard that he collapses. He freaks out, right? Because nothing he had really done up to that point was crazy, even though there's like stories of girls saying like he pulled pieces of my hair out and stuff. It was like very intense. And so he's like, cool, I'm out, right? So he literally ghosted. I mean, it was probably the most immoral thing that he did in the moment, I would say, in his life. He thought he was a really bad person. I think that was probably the worst thing, is he just disappeared and sort of just avoided that. He would return later, by the way, and apologize to them, to the children that were still alive, and it was a mixed reaction. Many of them were like, there was no problem. A couple of them were like, I don't care what you're saying right now. Like, it doesn't matter to me, And so, don't hit kids. But anyways, so he ends up moving at that point. He spends some time in Vienna. I'll gloss over this real quick. He ends up designing a house. It's called Haus Wittgenstein today in Vienna, and he built it with an architect around this time after this whole debacle. And you can go visit that house today in Vienna. It's a beautiful piece of modernist art. He designed all the windows, the latches, the radiators to such an excruciating level of detail that he had the ceiling at one point raised a couple centimeters because the builders didn't follow his instructions. I mean, he was very like, there's a right and a wrong way to do this. We'll gloss over that though. You can look it up. It's actually now used by the Bulgarian embassy, so you can go visit the house, but it's got a bunch of Bulgarians in it, which is hysterical, and they've partitioned the walls and things to do Bulgarian stuff. I don't know what Bulgarians do, but I have been there. It's a beautiful house, but it's Wittgenstein's style. They'd probably want them to bulldoze it at this point because it's so far from like the vision he had for it. But let's fast forward here. So this whole time, the Tractatus takes off, and he becomes like the preeminent philosopher in the philosophy of language and mathematics. And everyone in Cambridge is like, you have to come back. You have to come back. He's kind of exhausted his options. The house is finished. He's beat the children. And so he's decided, well, I'll go back to school. So he goes back to school. He finally returns to Cambridge. And there's a very famous letter from one of his friends that said, well, God has arrived in Cambridge. I just met him on the 4 or 5 o'clock train, right? And that was kind of the status that he was known in English philosophy and English academics. A cumbersome person, though, that people wanted him to come, but they also didn't want him to spend too much time because he would be the kind of friend that would show up on your couch and talk to you for 5 hours, and he didn't really care if you were asleep or not. He would wake you up, right? He was an extremely tiring person to be around because he was so intense and exacting. But anyways, he returns, submits his book, the Tractatus, which is famous now as his dissertation, and as a formality is watched over by Russell and by, I think it's G.E. Moore, another prominent English philosopher. He does his dissertation defense, and he's given something like an honorary doctrine of a kind, right? And famously or allegedly ends the whipping by telling Russell and Moore, he says, like, it's fine with me. I know you'll never understand this book. Okay, so he seemed very aware that no one was ever going to understand what the hell he was talking about. Very good. So he ends up getting his doctorate, and now the great thing is now, remember, he has no money. He has to work for the rest of his life now. He has no money. He won't accept money either. So he has to work, and so he ends up being offered a teaching position at Cambridge, which is not too shabby, right? He hated it. But he gets this and ends up becoming a very well-known teacher and very well sought out as well. So about this time, though, being in the kind of the academic soup, if you will, he's already had begun to have problems with his philosophy as it was written in the Tractatus. He invented something that is known as the picture theory of language, where propositions or sentences are a picture of reality. I'm not entirely clear on what that means, but he thought it was a mistake, so we're just going to, again, gloss over that. And he shifts to a new idea, and this is the idea we're going to look at. And he moves to what is known as language games. And his major point here is when we talk, what we're doing is playing a kind of game. And that game is largely governed by rules. So if you're in the Midwest and you say, hi, hello, how you doing? I'm good, how are you? I'm good, blah, blah, blah. That's a game, and there's certain rules you play when you play that game. You're supposed to say, oh, I'm doing good. You're not supposed to say, actually, my back really hurts, I'm grumpy, and I have sleep apnea, right? You don't do this. This is weird. You broke the rules if you did this, right? So he identifies this. He realizes that conversations are kind of language games. And so he spends his time for the rest of his life developing that idea that our exchanges are games. We play with one another. And he literally means this as gamified, right? So akin to something like chess or checkers or what have you. But again, we'll dig into that later. The last thing to note, he was very, very well regarded as a teacher, apparently a really great teacher, but his style was different. He demonstrated, and he worked with the students together to work out problems. He didn't lecture like I'm doing, right? He was conversing, and then there would be long periods of silence where he was cursing to himself in British and British English, how bloody this, whatever, and trying to understand. But the method, and this will become important later, the method was demonstrated. It wasn't professed. It wasn't taught. Anyways, he doesn't like it. He doesn't like being an academic. He doesn't like being a laborer. He doesn't like much of anything. He's never in the right conditions for himself. But it's clear to me from the biography, he doesn't really know how to achieve the kind of peace in his soul that he needs. I don't even know if he knew what it looked like. But he doesn't like academia. He's constantly like, I gotta leave, I hate this. Well, it's about the 1940s, and we know what happens next. 1930s, sorry. The Second World War breaks out, and he ends up using that as an excuse to abandon Cambridge and to serve again in the war effort. And so this is how he kind of escapes the academic world. So what he does is he goes and works as a hospital porter. And so he's just literally pushing a cart around and giving drugs to patients. And this is, by the way, this bit of advice, this idea of service is something he told his students this to do constantly. Whenever they would say, oh, I'm going to go get my master's or my doctorate in philosophy or mathematics, you say, don't do that. That's a horrible idea. Go become a mechanic. And there was like students that would do this. They would, because they were so enamored with him, they would follow his advice. So you'd have these like very academic, very gifted children. They were like working in like auto parts stores and stuff, because he would convince them for whatever reason that the good life or the ethical life or the whatever the right thing is to do is that. But he didn't only profess it, he lived that. And so he's serving as a hospital porter. Famously, as he's handing out the medications to the patients, he's also telling them, don't take your medication. I don't think the doctors know what they're talking about when they tell you to take this. He's not convinced, and so you shouldn't be either, right? And so the administration's like, you really got to stop telling our patients to not take their medicine. What ends up happening is he doesn't tell anyone. He's like a superhero in disguise. He's like Clark Kent. And they're like, you're Wittgenstein, aren't you? He's like, oh, crap. But he ends up becoming a researcher at the hospital. He works on shell shock. Actually, him and his research team transformed the medical definition of shell shock during that time. They essentially said that the way that it was defined was too broad, such that it had no meaning at all. And basically, that shell shock doesn't exist as a diagnosis. He also invents a blood pressure cuff of some kind that I don't think we have patents for that anymore, or the designs. I think that was lost, but apparently it was revolutionary at its time. So this is Wittgenstein. This is what he did. He's much older now too, and he's starting to struggle with ill health. But this is what he does during World War II. The whole time he's working on what will become the philosophical investigations, and that is the text he spends the rest of his life working on. And it was sort of more or less ready to be published when he died. And you can read it today. It's often considered his magnum opus, I would say, but it wasn't really properly finished. So he's working on that as sort of his final magnum opus. Eventually, in around 1947, he's been teaching, he's been working on his research, and he doesn't give a damn at all about publishing. He doesn't care about this at all. For him, philosophy is it's a method and it's an activity, and it's personal. It's part of his ethical orientation, if you will. And so he finally does leave Cambridge. He's saved up enough money to do that, and he pretty much spends the rest of his life moving from house to house until he passes away from, I think it was prostate cancer. He was able to save money, by the way, because he didn't buy anything. He would live in a room with only a couple chairs and things, right? He just didn't own much, and so he didn't spend much. So he wanders around in Ireland for a few years, going between bouts of sickness and productivity, until he gets to the point where he has to go back to Cambridge, where his safety net is. And he ends up passing away. He ends up passing away in 1951, about 3 days after his birthday. And his famous last words are, "Tell them that I had a wonderful life." And that is more or less the end of his biography as written as well. And when I got to that point, I was like, that's your assessment? Like, I didn't get this sense that you thought your life was wonderful. Because he spent the whole time being deeply upset about so much, about being misunderstood, about having done wrong things. He would go through these periods of solitude in Norway where he'd exile himself. And then he would also do these odd things. He would confront these people and apologize to them for all the mistakes he made, right? I didn't use this person's name, right? Just very, very minute things that people wouldn't even remember. But he had lied. He had done something wrong, and he had to atone for that. If you read his biography, you just get the sense that he was just tortured. Like he fell from some planet, and he didn't belong here, and he couldn't figure out how to exist. And in the moment he finally had, suicide wasn't an option, apparently. So he finally had a way out. And he was at peace with that. He's like, okay, good, I'm ready to go. That's why Ray Monk, his biographer, I think, thinks of him as a genius of a kind, as he's just a completely different kind of spirit that didn't really belong here, but he was here, and, we got what we got from him. Good. So the first thing I want to do is situate him within the context of the history of philosophy. So he worked primarily in the philosophy of language, logic, and mathematics. That's what he's known for. It's what he's known for today. He dabbled in psychology a little bit as well, but this is his focus. And importantly, because this is what distinguishes him from his peers, he was interested in mathematics, logic, and language from the natural language perspective. So he wasn't working so much in symbols. He wasn't working on problems. He wasn't working on theorems and things. He was interested in the foundations of mathematics, the foundations of logic, of language from natural language. This is completely different from what Russell, Frege, etc. are doing. They're working with theoretical mathematics. They're they're manipulating symbols. They're trying to derive mathematics out of logic. Just really insane stuff. So where he was working in philosophy, a very, very technical, very specific domain in philosophy. You also know he didn't publish anything, right? He didn't really write much. He wrote a lot, but he didn't publish anything. For me, that allows me to see him as a kindred spirit of a number of philosophers that followed that practice, people that didn't write at all, but were teachers or philosophers as something that they lived and practiced. So thinking specifically of Socrates, Plato's Socrates, he didn't write anything, apparently. Maybe a couple things, it's all gone. And Epictetus, he's a Stoic philosopher, he didn't write anything either. What we have is the remembrances of his contemporaries. And this is also true for Wittgenstein. His work, and I would recommend it as a good starting place, the Blue and Brown books. Those are notes from a class. He didn't publish things, right? What I think that we can get out of that is that for him, philosophy wasn't an academic pursuit. He only did that because he had to make money. I think that's revelatory, though. We learn that for him, philosophy is personal. It's lived. It's not something that you know. It's something that you do. Good. So let's get into the trenches with Wittgenstein, and we're going to talk about a little bit more about language games. We're going to talk about rule following, what is nebulously known as forms of life, and then culture. These are all kind of buzzwords or buzz concepts in his philosophy. I've introduced the idea a little bit, so that'll help things out. But let's get a snapshot of his approach to philosophy first. And so what I want to read for you is it's an excerpt from his biography that a student or whomever had written that he had spoke in class. In teaching philosophy, I'm like a guide showing you how to find your way around London. I have to take you through the city from the north to south, from east to west, from Euston to the Embankment, and from Piccadilly to the Marble Arch. After I have taken you many journeys through the city, in all sorts of directions, we shall have passed through any given street a number of times. So same street, but you visited a number of times. Each time traversing that street is part of a different journey. At the end of this, you will know London. You will be able to find your way about like a born Londoner. Of course, a good guide will take you through the more important streets more often than he takes you down the side street. A bad guide will do the opposite. And he quips in philosophy, I'm a rather bad guide. So for him, what we get from this is that teaching philosophy is much like being a city guide. And he's going to focus this. He's going to focus this concept of teaching and practicing philosophy in his work. But he's a guide. And he's taking you through, ends up being language in tons of different ways, back and forth until you've exhausted every route. And then you understand the meaning of the way the words are used, basically. This is his later philosophy in a nutshell, that meaning is use. How you use the word tells you what the word means. This seems, by the way, this is just kind of a fun anecdote. He lived in Ireland towards the end of his life, and he embodied this. He literally lived this bodily. So he would walk obsessively in Ireland at this time, talking, writing to himself and stuff. And there's stories of people finding him. And one time they found Wittgenstein. He was sitting in a ditch, writing like a mad Austrian in his notebook, because the muse had come down and spoke to him. And then another one, again, in the village in Ireland where he was, that people were really weird. It's like, this guy is really weird, really strange dude. They found him, he was just like kind of arrested in the middle of the road, and he had been drawing pictures in the dirt with his walking stick, and he was like talking to himself, and he stood there for a long time before he ended up walking on, right? And so he professed this guide thing. We're going to come back to this, and he lived it as well. There's something about navigation that is important for his life and his thought. Good. So one of the things he's most famous for is coining this concept of a language game. I've spoken a little bit about it already. A language game is any kind of interaction that we have between each other, which is governed by a set of rules of some kind. There's legal and there's illegal moves that you can make in a conversation, in an exchange, in a lecture, anything of this kind. Importantly, he says that these language games have rules. You can break them. So that raises the question, what determines the rules of the game? Is it agreement? He doesn't think it's agreement. So he doesn't think that there's really ever a time where we all get together and say, hey, let's have an exchange called pleasantries, or called let's talk about the weather. And we'll agree on how you can do that and then move forward. There's never a period in human history where we explicitly sit down and do that. And so the rules of the game are not determined by agreement of the users. In fact, he would say that agreement is a language game in itself. It's a whole other thing. So what determines how you play these exchanges? What determines how you ought to exchange with one another, how you dialogue with each other? And he says that what governs it is forms of life. This is kind of a nebulous term. And so we can, we'll say language games determined by rules, and those rules are given to you by your culture, more or less. Good. Okay, so language games, that's what we do. There's rules to them. You speak to each other like this. That's culturally determined. That's an argument. So he has to support that. He needs to rally evidence in support of this view that this is in fact how things go in logic. And what he does is he analyzes humor to demonstrate this, that your form of life, your culture, is what fixes or determines how you engage in language games of humor. And he shows this or demonstrates this, and we often do this, not only in real life, but in philosophy as well. You break the thing, right? Things become clearer to you the moment they're broken. When they're not broken, they sort of disappear in your engagement, right? In your engagement in the world. And so he asks, What is it like for people not to have the same sense of humor? They do not react properly to each other. It's as though there was a custom amongst certain people for one person to throw a ball and another person is supposed to catch and throw it back, but some people, instead of throwing it back, they put the ball in their pocket. I love this, and that's the extent of this little chunk in his work, because he wrote very aphoristically, and so he says, what it's like, and this is an analogy, this is like a side road, what it's like when humor breaks down is like that. So imagine you're playing baseball and someone knocks it almost out of the park, rolling across the green, person picks up the ball, instead of chucking it back to first base to try to get people out, et cetera, the catcher puts it in his pocket, right? And everyone's like, what the hell are you doing? And he's like, I'm playing baseball. And they're like, you're not. Well, you're not playing American baseball. And he's like, well, I'm playing baseball. Okay. They're playing different games. They might both be playing games, but they're playing different games. That's kind of how he sees these things breaking down. And of course, if you're culturally inoculated in American baseball, you know the rules and you play the rules. You play the game correctly. I wanted to give another example to try to make the humor idea clearer and let it hit more at home for you. Think of this exchange, right? Blonde walks into a bar. She says, ouch. We're playing a language game. I told the joke. The rules of the game is now that you are supposed to laugh, and you don't laugh, right? If you do laugh, it could be for different reasons. Could be for, you were born in 1930 and your idea of pinup models and things, Marilyn Monroe, et cetera, et cetera. This is your idea of beauty and ditziness and whatever the heck we were doing in the 20th century. You understand the rules culturally at that point, you laugh. You can imagine maybe a subculture of people who are actually just find that joke funny because of the equivocation of terms, right? And that's also part of the joke. I tend to think that most humor is actually just us breaking reasoning, breaking logic by doing dumb things intentionally. And so what we have here is we're equivocating on the word bar between somewhere like an establishment where you go and drink alcohol, or a metal beam, right? And so har, 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 it's funny. You can also imagine a language game where somebody uses a blonde joke for pedagogical reasons, and I'm sort of like obliquely referring or inferring the joke, not because I think it's real or that we should treat people like this or that it's even funny, but that it's an opportunity to talk about things. Even this itself is a kind of language game. Of course, me using it as an example is indicative of my background, of my culture, the fact that I read too many books and have nobody to talk to, right? So I find this funny and blah, blah, blah. The point of that is just to demonstrate that we have a basic language game exchange. I tell a joke. The rules that we follow when we approach it are different. They're culturally informed. What determines your culture? At this point, we kind of have to stop because you can just kind of keep going back. And also he believes, so something that Wittgenstein was deeply perturbed by, he talked about a lot and thought about a lot, was the limits of language. He didn't think that you could do everything or achieve or accomplish everything in language. And so he was always interested in delimiting language and in thinking about what lays beyond that. I tend to think what he ends up gesturing at is lived experience. So he's telling you there's a point where you have to stop talking. I can teach you, I can tell you all about the rules of baseball. You're not going to be able to play baseball, period. You won't be able to do it, right? So there's something else you have to do that is not linguistic, and that is you have to go play baseball. I can tell you why Brahms and Mahler are amazing composers, but unless you listen and learn to appreciate through doing, it's not going to matter. So one of the quotes I wanted to read to you to kind of reinforce my take on this, or my position on this, is he was on a walk in Ireland. He was walking with one of his friends, and they passed a child, and Wittgenstein was really interested in the child's expression. He had this view in the philosophical investigations. He said that every inward sensation or experience is in need of an outward criteria. So there's no such thing as like private experience. It's always betrayed somehow, and it's either betrayed linguistically or through expression, physiognomy, you name it. So he's looking at this child's face, and he yells at his walking partner. He says, just look at that child's face. You don't take enough notice of people's faces. It's a fault you ought to try to correct. And so I think it's very fascinating that he really wanted his walking partner to just look, observe the face, learn and understand it, see what we can learn from it. And that's how he ends the Tractatus, by the way. He pretty much says, like, we're at the point now that I've spoken beyond the borders of language, and it's nonsense. It makes no sense. and you've climbed up the ladder of my book, and now you have to kick the ladder out from underneath your feet and go do something else. And so that's partially why I think when he finished the Tractatus, he says, he literally felt, I have nothing more to say. I have everything to do. So our cultural engagement is what informs our Lebensform, our life forms, and the rules we follow and the way that we talk, converse, and exchange with each other. So that gives us a really good overview. All I want to do now is just to sharpen this distinction of philosophy as an activity akin to serving as a city guide. On my pretty poor reading, I've been reading Wittgenstein now for, I think, over 10 years, and I don't understand him at all. But on my reading, this gets pretty close to what he was doing in philosophy. So we're gonna talk about that a little bit, and then I'm just gonna give a couple gestures towards, well, how can we just adopt some of this for our personal lives? I always want to make sure that there's something that we can take from this and live with. That, or I just like to assign homework. But I think it's probably I just like to give people homework, actually. But philosophy is surveying. Importantly, he wrote the philosophical investigations in German. And so that when we're translating terms here, we have to be a little bit careful. He doesn't use the term to survey. It's in German, it's übersichten, which means to look over. Survey is Latin, right? So it's kind of the same, but it's also a technical term in English. And I actually thought that maybe he was using it as the technical sense. So surveyors are people that survey lands. They plot them out. How many miles is this road? Where does it intersect where? It's a technical art. I checked the German on this. He doesn't seem to be indicating that in the German, and so it's not warranted in the English either. But I'm sure he was aware of that concept. And so we can kind of think of that a little bit in this light. So he says basically all that philosophy is the act of surveying, to overviewing language. Basically all philosophical problems take the same form, and that form is, he writes, that I don't know my way about in language, right? And so any and all philosophical problems are merely you being lost as a wanderer or as a traveler in your language. That's it. And what philosophy does is gives you a survey. It gives you a map of that language landscape, if you will, so that you may be able to navigate it again. The next thing to ask here is, why do philosophical problems arise in the first place? He writes, a main source of our failure to understand anything is that we don't have an overview of the use of our words. Our grammar is deficient in surveyability. It's kind of a cumbersome word, but that's how they translated it. A surveyable representation produces precisely that kind of understanding which consists in seeing connections. Hence the importance of finding and inventing intermediate links. He puts intermediate links in italics here, and I believe that he's talking about using analogy. Something he did a lot in his work is use analogy to untangle tangles, right? And so I think that's what he's referring to there. But then he goes on to say that, here it is. Yeah, so he says, it's not the business of philosophy to resolve a contradiction by means of a mathematical or logical mathematical discovery, but to render viewable or surveyable the state of mathematics, logic, whatever it is, that troubles us, the state of affairs before the contradiction is resolved. So before the issue in our language arises. Here, the fundamental fact is that we lay down rules, a technique for playing a game, some kind of language exchange, and that then when we follow those rules, things don't turn out the way we had assumed somehow. And for that reason, we end up getting entangled in those rules. That's what these entanglements are. That's what philosophical, mathematical, any domain problems are, is that we get entangled in the rules that we had laid out culturally as a participant in society. And now we don't know what to do, right? We say things like, well, that's not what I meant, or you oughtn't to make those kind of jokes, or I don't think that's funny, or I don't understand what you're saying, or why are Midwesterners so friendly? You know, Europeans say this. They're always like, oh, how are you doing? You're doing good, but you don't really mean it, right? Europeans think we're all liars in the US. It's wonderful. No, we're just playing different games, right? So what philosophy does is it looks at that mess, that entanglement. You can literally think of a knot here. And he says that it surveys it. It looks at the problem before it's resolved. Importantly, it can't change the language. And this is why he says that philosophers that end up inventing new concepts or new theories and all these, these cool, crazy things, They're making a big mistake. The reason for that is, I'll use the analogy here, as if you're a backpacker and you're in the backcountry and you need a map to walk through the wilderness. And if you get lost, if I produce a map for you and you're able to navigate, you're going to get through it. But if in the process of surveying that landscape for you, I change the landscape and then I give you a map for a different landscape than the one you're in, the problem is still going to exist and you're going to have a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. And this tends to be what Wittgenstein thinks happens a lot in philosophy, is that we ignore real problems because real problems are problems of language, as everyone discourses in them. And then we do things like invent things, right? So, classically Plato, he's like, what's the form of the good? And Wittgenstein would be like, there's no such thing. But, then we have an entire Western philosophical tradition from an error, basically, is what Wittgenstein would say. And he seemed to believe this because he didn't read other philosophers, by the way. I don't love that about him, but he didn't care about the history of philosophy, apparently. So back to Wittgenstein, he thinks that what philosophy does is it's not to interfere at all with the actual use of language, he writes. So in the end, it can only describe it, for it cannot justify it either. There's no justification because it's a language game. It's in the language game and presupposes the rules just as much as any other language game. And so in the end, what it does is it just leaves everything as it is if it's done its job correctly. Philosophy lays everything out, doesn't change anything. And then what it does, and this is the oddest thing, the thing is that we do as philosophers then, or applying this method, is that if we've genuinely laid it out, he says, philosophy just puts everything before us and neither explains nor deduces anything. Since everything lies open to view, there's nothing to explain. You've literally done it all. For whatever may be hidden is of no interest to us. And what he means by that is if it's the kind of thing that is not public, is not given as socially, it doesn't matter anyways. It's not in the same domain, different thing he doesn't care about. He's very dismissive of this. It's known as his private language argument in the philosophical investigations. He's like, if you want to sit there and pretend you have a special world, go ahead. But the world and language is public, period. It's a social thing. And so he seems to think that once you've done this, you've clarified the language, the issue is done. There's not really much, at least for the philosopher, to do. And he says that if you follow this method, he suggests that philosophy as surveying is what must happen before any new discoveries or inventions in language, since everything is mediated by language, whether it's mathematics, physics, whatever. This is what has to take place before any new discoveries are made, right? So that's what he thinks philosophy is, and that's how he develops it from this picture theory of language to philosophy of surveying. And what I kind of think that what he's doing here is he kind of deregulates philosophy, knocks it down and says, what it basically does is it clarifies and it seeks to understand, and then it's done. It can offer nothing else. And then it's the job of the participants in the language game to proceed forward, right? And so if I encounter, for example, a mathematical problem or something in physics, and there's an entanglement, and we have all these disagreements. The philosopher is the one, he's like the cleanup crew. He'll come through, he'll untangle the ball of thread, lay it all out, and then he goes away. He's done. And then it's the physicists or whatever domain that you're in that will continue to use the language as it actually is used, right? So it's sort of an unglorified view of philosophy. Also becomes inherently very personal, right? Because it's obviously you could see this being used in professional settings, but he lives this in his day-to-day life as something that he did, and that's why he would spend time, I made a mistake, I lied about this, he'd apologize to his friends and families and things, because he was entangled and he needed to make that right again. So that gives us a pretty good sense of Wittgenstein's philosophy, I think. And so the last thing I want to say here before we wrap up is just how can we apply this in our own lives? And I think I was meditating on this. I think there's kind of two really obvious ways that we can apply them. So the first one is that we're human beings. We use tools. We're really into creating solutions to problems. We're really good at it too. And it's even sort of a kind of a trope, right? Like you don't listen, you just try to solve my problems, you don't understand them. Wittgenstein seemed to have this gripe as well. And what he seems to be suggesting in his work is that we need to spend, instead of 80% time on the solution and 20% on the problem, we need to flip that. The work is in understanding the problem. And so the thing that we can take away from his method is understanding and appreciating that the right thing to do if we want a solution is not to develop a solution, it's to understand the problem, which might mean spending more time with the problem than we've ever been comfortable with before. Because he seems to believe within certain domains that you'll get to a point that once you understand the problem, someone else can fix it or the solution's already baked into the explanation. Maybe there wasn't a problem at all, right? So I think that we can kind of take that on in our own lives and appreciate that problems aren't things to be solved only. They're things to be appreciated. And that doesn't come naturally, and it's really hard to do. Second thing, the method he's offering. So philosophy is surveying, and again, these last 2 points are a little bit me kind of not shooting from the hip, but these are my views. Philosophy is surveying is itself a kind of language game. Wittgenstein did not believe that there was such thing as like a meta discourse over logic, or ordinary language. He didn't believe this at all. If you're doing philosophy, you're doing something adjacent to natural language, or you're doing something within normal natural language. It's nothing above. There's nothing like that. This pissed everyone off in philosophy, by the way. They really didn't like him for this. But he said, you want to play this game, you're just playing a different game, but you're always playing games. So we have to say on pain of contradiction, basically, that philosophy of surveying is a language game. What's great, and what I've tried to pull out of this for us here, is that we learn a new game. We've learned a new game, a new way of playing when we engage with each other. And we can put that to good use, right? So anywhere in our lives where we might have issues, contradictions, or entanglements in language, we now have at least a sense or an invitation to reflect on that philosophically, literally, as a method and say, well, why is this the case, right? And so then we can do things like look at a person's life form. Well, what is it that they live? What is that they do? This is, by the way, Wittgenstein inventing empathy through philosophy. So he discovered empathy, apparently. But you just ask yourself, well, what is it? What is this person about, right? Where are they from? What does that mean for them? They're not wrong. They're playing the game different. And so it's an invitation to do that. And so that's Ludwig Wittgenstein's life and thought in a nutshell. I'm going to wrap this up real quick. I'm going to dangle the carrot now, and I'll say if you're still kind of scratching your head and saying, cool, well, how do I do it? How do I do that method, philosophy of surveying? I will invite you to read his works, because he seemed to believe, as I suggest during the segment on his life, that he didn't have a theory to offer. He had nothing to teach you or tell you. He had something to show you. So the only way to see it in action is to go and read his work, particularly the Blue and Brown books and the Philosophical Investigation. So I would invite you to read it, to see that method, so that you can then adapt it and see if it's useful in your life, or see how you might do it. And so we're kind of at that point now where there's nothing left to say, and there's only that which we must go and do. So thank you so much for your attendance. And that is Ludwig Wittgenstein, people.